centers of the world. And that is partly the result of history, a lot the result of geography, and a lot the result of the very clever leadership of Hong Kong for many decades by many entrepreneurs and government leaders. So this is a unique place. And as a unique place, I think it continues to have a unique role in all the issues that we talked about. China and Hong Kong specifically will play a huge role in the global transformation to sustainable development. So the next decades will require tremendous changes of infrastructure and technology, and that will require a tremendous amount of expertise, business management, and finance. And that's where Hong Kong comes in, because Hong Kong has all these components to really help the world to achieve the transformation that it needs. And so that's good business and a very good contribution to the world as well. We are entering an era of new sustainable finance, where finance is going to play the crucial role in enabling all of the transformations of the energy system, of global agriculture, of trade patterns, of electric vehicles, of smart cities. And Hong Kong's very well positioned in that. And I think for the mainland, Hong Kong remains essential for the mainland's prosperity and development, and the mainland economy is absolutely key for Hong Kong's economic future as well, because China is the world's efficient, low-cost producer of green infrastructure. And so China really is going to be the main exporter of electric vehicles, of smart grid systems, of 5G and 6G, and of many other things. And Hong Kong is going to be right there to help finance it, to make the deals, to be able to help design the solutions, the business solutions, to make the supply chains and so forth. So this is a very good position for Hong Kong in the future. First, many Western observers say lots of things about China for political reasons. So these are popular things to say. Americans are in the habit right now of attacking China almost every day, every word. So I wouldn't take straightforwardly any statements that are made, because a lot of this is just regular bad-mouthing. In fact, every time an American official opens their mouth, just about, it's something negative. There have been a couple of exceptions. I was happy to see that Secretary Blinken wished China good on National Day. Okay, that was nice that he did that. I wish that he would do that on other days as well. I believe, and I am optimistic, that leaders in Beijing understand very well the importance of Hong Kong's distinctiveness and its unique role in the world, and how hard won that is, and how it reflects a long, long pattern of building expertise in Hong Kong, building trust in the institutions in Hong Kong, and thereby creating one of the great financial and trade centers of the world. And there's no doubt in my mind that Hong Kong is extremely important for China's success for the mainland. So I think it would be absolutely misguided, absolutely mistaken, if any steps were taken that would undermine that. My own experience is that mainland leaders don't make such mistakes, and they're very good at economic management and at understanding realities. And that's why I'm confident that Hong Kong's distinctive role not only will be respected, but actually will grow for the reasons that I've said. We need in 25 years a major structural change in the world economy. That is hard to produce without a tremendous amount of financial expertise and a tremendous amount of global supply chain cooperation. And Hong Kong is very well placed for that. In fact, you could not reinvent it in time, so you better use it well. My basic belief is that our global reality pushes us very hard towards cooperation, because for 8 billion people to live well on this planet, we need a global system that functions properly. If we end up in a massive division of the world, a massive crisis, much less war, the consequences would be devastating for everybody. So I start from the proposition that the gains of cooperation are overwhelmingly large. And I know, as an economist that has worked on these issues for more than 40 years, how deeply intertwined we are. I also know that we have a nation-state system in a world where we need global governance. This is a problem because it means that our international institutions, and the one that I work at and for, the United Nations, is too weak. We don't have the kind of global governance to enforce a treaty or to ensure that countries don't free ride or to stop wars and so on. So I'm very much aware of that. I'm also very much aware that the whole idea of creating an international legal framework is actually quite new. You know, the first international organization attempt was only 1921, the League of Nations. So it's only 1 century in all the millennia of human history that we've even tried to have global cooperation. The League of Nations failed completely, collapsed, and then came the UN in 1945, which was the best idea of the best American president, Franklin Roosevelt, really our greatest president. Now, the UN is very, very fragile in a way. We need it, but instead of having that strength for a global system, it depends on the cooperation of the individual countries, especially the United States, Russia, China, and others. And since the cooperation level is quite low right now, this can absolutely paralyze the function of the United Nations as well. So I'm not unaware of how difficult this is. And I'm not trying to give any country a free pass. I do feel my responsibility to a large extent is to look at my own country first and criticize my own country first. And I hope that inspires others to look at their countries and to try to improve their country's performance. It's too easy to point the finger at some other country. So I don't like to do that anyway. I would rather try to inspire confidence by everybody saying, you know, we all can do better than we're doing. But my message professionally is we had better solve these problems cooperatively. We had better strengthen global cooperation, because if we don't, there are no winners and losers. Everybody loses if we don't get this right. And I learned, to my surprise in a way, I'm an economist, and I deal a lot increasingly with international relations specialists. and foreign policy specialists. And they view the world as winners and losers. So their big question is, who's number one? Is it the United States or is it China? I find this question absurd, frankly, because there is no number one. There is only cooperation and coexistence, not the question of who's number one and who's number two. So I just view the questions rather differently. It's an old argument that I'm making because for more than a century, many people have said, no, there are no winners in war. And then wars come anyway. And then the wars prove there are no winners in the wars, only the losers. So it's not that the people were wrong, it's that in a world of nation states, we are still stuck in interstate conflict. But we have to move beyond the conflict. And my favorite realist expert is a well-known professor in the United States named John Mearsheimer. And he became very well known in recent years because he rather predicted the Ukraine war. And his book that made him very famous is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, because he says it's almost inevitable that great power politics ends in tragedy, because great powers are always fighting for dominance. And my answer to him is, John, we can't accept tragedy. We have to write the solution to the tragedy, not accept the tragedy. So this is not automatic or easy. And I'm not predicting success. I'm just saying we had better spend our effort to make success. And for me, it's very basic that given this capacity, there should be no economic suffering in the world of basic conditions, basic deprivation, extreme poverty, because while that was inevitable 200 years ago, it should be out of the question today. So since I'm an economist and I see the power of our tools, it's rather frustrating to me to know that there are still 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, many hundreds of millions of children who don't have enough to eat or a place in a schoolroom or other basic amenities for a healthy and productive life. I'll start with, again, the same data that I mentioned earlier, but for the US and China. If you measure output in China and the US at what's called international prices, a common set of prices, or what's called purchasing adjusted prices, the Chinese economy is bigger than the US economy. China is currently about 18% of world output, and the US is about 15.5% of world output. This is a fundamental change from 40 years ago. In 1980, the US was about 21% of world output, and China was about 2.5% of world output. Between 1980 and 2020, China grew at a rate of nearly 10% per year. When you have economic growth at 10% per year, it means your economy doubles in size every 7 years. So in 35 years, it doubles 5 times, or 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, 32-time increase. And that's basically what happened with China. Why, by the way? Because China started incredibly poor, and it caught up to a significant extent. When you're poor, there's lots of headroom. Electrification, education, building roads, building rail, and that's what China did extremely effectively for 40 years. Excellent economic management for 40 years. And now, they didn't close the gap in living standards because the living standards by this measure that I keep referring to puts China at about 30% of the US level, but since China's 4 times the population, it makes it a larger economy in total. Well, let me just give you the upshot of this. This is freaking out American policymakers. It's what a psychologist or a psychiatrist would call a neurotic reaction, because no one gave China the permission to be bigger than the United States. And that wasn't supposed to happen. In 1992, the US achieved unipolar status, the sole superpower. And that was supposed to last for many decades. And lo and behold, 30 years later, it ended. And the American reaction is, we are so smart, we are so good, we are so effective that China must really have cheated at every moment. And they really must be our enemy also. This is extremely dangerous. It's either us or them at the top of the world. And only a US-led world is a safe world. Otherwise, we're all going to be destroyed by China. It is, in my view, a fantasy misunderstanding. I'll start again with the basic proposition. China's living standards are about 1/3 of the US. China has decades of economic development to make. China faces major challenges. Population is now starting to decline quite significantly. China will probably be under 1 billion people by the end of this century, possibly 800 million, according to the UN forecasts, which are mechanical, but still showing how significant. China will age very rapidly. There are many, many challenges. China's not out to take over the world. But the U.S. whole vision is U.S. is the world leader. It's the self-image. It's what I'm afraid is taught at the Kennedy School of Government often.
My question would be the following one. If we assume that this conflict is going to end in a way that's not going to be a defeat, an explicit defeat of Russia, do you see that having any consequences of the future role of dollar as an international currency? And what do you think is going to happen on the US Treasury bond market in the future? Thank you.
Just in a general word about the role of the US dollar. It has been a source of a lot of US power and prerogative, the fact that about 60% of world trade is denominated in dollars and settled in dollars. And the US banking system is the predominant mechanism for clearing transactions. And the SWIFT system, which is how the US banking system settles transactions, is the instrument by which the US excludes Russia, for example, under the sanctions. I believe that in 10 years from now, the role of the dollar will be much, much less than it is today. And in 20 years, we'll have a very different international monetary system. And the U.S. will have lost what was called by de Gaulle an exorbitant privilege, but it will have lost a privilege of having the key currency in the world. I think there are 3 reasons for this decline that will come, that's already underway. One is that to be the world currency depends on being the predominant economy in the world. And as the U.S. share of the world economy diminishes, it's natural that the role of the U.S. dollar would diminish as well. And we are, as I said, on a gradual, gentle decline, not gentle, but gradual decline of the share of world output due to the U.S., not mainly because of the U.S. collapse, but mainly because the rest of the world develops economically, like China. So that's one reason. The second reason is much more pertinent to this evening, and that is the U.S. began to weaponize the dollar roughly a decade ago. So it basically began to use the dollar as a geopolitical instrument. And my advice is, if you are a government that isn't getting along too well with the U.S., hold your reserves in some other currency. Because the U.S. has developed a bad habit of seizing foreign exchange reserves of governments that it doesn't like. And it has done that with Venezuela, with Iran, with Afghanistan, with North Korea, and now with Russia. It views that as an easy thing to do. Stroke of a pen by the president, and your antagonist, your foe, can't use their dollars anymore. We even did that with Afghanistan on the way out, froze all the foreign exchange reserves so that the economy completely collapsed in that impoverished place afterwards. It's nasty, by the way. But more than being nasty, it also is not something you can do over and over again, because other countries start to say, maybe we'll hold our reserves in renminbi, thank you, or maybe we'll hold them in some other currency, thank you. And that's what's happening now. So that's a second reason for why the dollar will decline, because it's not just a money, it's an instrument of geopolitics, which it should not be. You can have one or the other, but you can't have the geopolitical instrument for very long. You won't have the key currency anymore. And the third is technological. I think that transactions will not be settled through commercial banks in the future in anything like the way they are now, because we will have digital central bank currencies. And we don't need the commercial banks in the long term to settle our transactions. Probably the digital renminbi will be a first digital currency, probably for use within China, but then it will start to be expanded internationally. Several other central banks will make digital currencies. This is quite different from crypto. Crypto is you have an electronic account that's nonsense, and you think it's going to hold value. It's every day I wake up, sorry to say if you're Bitcoin lovers, every day that Bitcoin has any value at all, I think the world's still crazy. So Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, and it's not a legal reserve currency for anything, and it's not a legal means of payment, and it's not a national fiat currency which can at least settle your debts internally. It's unbelievable that people spend money for this electronic cipher. And this arrest of this kid in the United States should tell you this is a little crazy. But what I'm talking about is something else, which is a central bank currency, because there, a digital central bank currency is just a means of clearing payments rather than writing checks like we used to do, or even making electronic ledgers through Venmo we use in the United States and so forth, whichever e-wallet system you use. The central bank can do that, actually. And I think that we'll go to that kind of settlements. And so the U.S. ability to say, we're going to cut you off from SWIFT, so what? So I think in 10 years or 15 years from now, it'll be quite a different international monetary system.
And my question is, what is your vision of the role of Russia in the future in the conflict of U.S. and China? Thank you very much.
The role of
Russia in the conflict between the U.S. and China.
The role of Russia in the conflict.
Yes.
Look, basically, much of the world, as I say, is going to have trade relations with China, because why not? It's a good trading partner. And China will be the world's main trading partner for a significant majority of the world. and Russia is among them, and physically being neighbors, so that Russia can make gas and oil pipelines and provide other raw materials which China doesn't have, makes them very complementary economies. And since the U.S. has designated both of them as enemies, it makes them natural allies. We did the one thing that Zbigniew Brzezinski said never do. Zbigniew Brzezinski was, the geopolitical strategist who in 1997 said how important Ukraine was for this geopolitical competition. But in his book, The Global Chessboard, he says, well, this will be the geographical pivot of Eurasia, but the one thing the United States must never do is drive China and Russia together. And then he says, but this is very unlikely to happen. And so, it's the U.S., you shouldn't declare enemies this way. It doesn't even make sense on your own terms of your own geopolitical competition. And that was Nixon's idea of triangulating between Russia and China, or Soviet Union and China, during the Cold War period. But we did what we were told, oh, that will never happen because it's such a bad idea. So right now, that is a friendship without limits, as they say, because the U.S. is targeting both of them. And the U.S. is talking the European Union into more and more of an anti-China policy. And I just can't believe it that Europe would fall for this. Because Europe, absolutely for its prosperity, needs a good relationship with China. And for a long time in the future, China will be a neighbor of Europe in Eurasia. And so you're actually on the same landmass, too. And so having good relations would be a good thing, but not in the U.S. mindset. And so the U.S. has launched a chips war against China. This is incredible, this chips war, just to, oh my God. I need an hour to say what I wanted to say, but I'll say it in 1 minute.
There's one more question.
The U.S. has said we're going to try to stop the Chinese economy from, modernizing at the front level by restricting the sale of advanced chips. Terrible idea, in my view. Completely belligerent. But yesterday, apparently, according to the Financial Times, I don't know whether it's definitive or not, Netherlands said we go along with this. If Europe just follows the U.S. on this, it's not going to defeat China, but it sure is going to boomerang against Europe. It makes no sense. And what Europe should be saying to the United States is, calm down. You're still powerful. We still like you. You don't have to, you're still richer than China per capita. You can calm down. We don't want a war with China, too. And that's what Europe should really be saying to the United States for its own good.
Thank you, Jeff. But there's one more question. And I really have to make an exception, because I really don't know what would have happened if I don't allow this, but my wife actually wants to ask a question. It catches me by surprise, so Natasha Yeremich wants to ask a question.
What is the current situation of climate change?
Okay, an easy question. Current situation on climate change. It's hot and getting hotter fast. And just to give you a couple of grim realities on this, the rate of warming of Earth on average has been 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade during the last 30 years. So that means that Earth has warmed by about half of 1 degree C over the past 30 years. Earth is now warming currently at about twice that rate, at about 0.36 degrees Celsius per decade. Now, compared to the pre-industrial temperature, the Earth is 1.2 degrees warmer than it was before industrialization. If you take 0.36 degrees C per decade, that means we'll be 1.56 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial 10 years from now. That means we will be above the limit set in the Paris Agreement within 10 years. And according to my favorite climatologist, Dr. James Hansen, who I've relied on for decades, and he's been right on everything he's told me for decades, he thinks that in the next few years, when we go from the La Nina cycle in the Pacific Ocean to an El Nino, which raises the Earth's temperature on what's called an interannual basis, we could have an excess beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Paris limit, within the next 5 years. The next big El Nino. We're in a La Nina right now. All of this is to say, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any doubt at all about global warming, it's real, it's serious, it's accelerating, and it's going to create a terrible mess no matter what we do. But if we don't do what we need to do, it's going to create a catastrophic mess.
China's continued its diplomatic outreach by offering last week to hold talks between Israel and Palestine. To look more at China's recent diplomatic actions, we're joined by David Sachs, director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University and president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He's also served as advisor to 3 UN Secretaries General and currently serves as a Sustainable Development Solutions advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. His latest article, published, is headlined, "The Need for a New U.S. Foreign Policy." Professor Sachs, thanks so much for being with us. All of the diplomatic gestures of China, you know, the meeting with Macron in Beijing, with Lula in Beijing, brokering this deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, now offering not only to negotiate between Ukraine and Russia, but Israel and Palestine. This hardly gets attention in the United States media. But around the world, the headlines are far more, there are far more headlines about this. Talk about the significance of this, and if you see a direct parallel between all the headway that China is making and increasing U.S. hostility towards China.
Thanks, Amy. Very good to be with you. And indeed, this is a crucial topic. And as President Xi Jinping said in that meeting with Macron, it is a historic watershed that the world is living through right now. What China is after, if we view it from China's perspective, is what was also said, true multilateralism. And what that means, or true multipolarity, another term that they use. And that means they don't want a US-led world. They want a multipolar world. And the basis of that is that the United States is 4.1% of the world population. China is 17.5% of the world population. China's economy is comparable to the U.S. economy, and indeed China is the lead trade partner for much of the world. So China is saying, we're there too, alongside you. We want a multipolar world. We don't want a U.S.-led world. And while the United States sometimes talks about a rule-based order, the fact of the matter is that the U.S. grand strategy, if we can use that term of the grand strategists of the U.S. State, see our grand strategy in the United States as being dominance. And I often refer to an article that I think is very clear, succinct, and revealing by a former colleague of mine at Harvard University, Robert Blackwell, an esteemed ambassador of the United States, who wrote in 2015 And I'll quote from the article: "Since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally." Well, China doesn't want the United States to be the preeminent power. It wants to live alongside the United States. Blackwell, writing in 2015, said China's rise is a threat to U.S. preeminence. And he laid out a series of steps that the Biden administration actually is following almost step by step. What Blackwell laid out already back in 2015 is that the United States should create, quote, "new preferential trading arrangements among U.S. friends and allies to increase their mutual gains through instruments that consciously exclude China. There should be a technology control regime to block China's strategic capabilities, a buildup of, quote, power political capacities of U.S. friends and allies on China's periphery, and strengthen U.S. military forces along the Asian rimland despite any Chinese opposition." This has become the Biden foreign policy. China knows it. China really is pushing back. But what's very important and interesting to understand, and we've seen it clearly in the dynamics involving the Ukraine war, most of the world also does not want the U.S. as the global preeminent power. Most of the world wants a multipolar world and is therefore not lined up behind the United States sanctions on Russia and so forth. And this was also the message of President Lula visiting China, saying to President Xi Jinping, we as Brazil also want multipolarity, true multipolarity, and we want peace, for example, in the Russian-Ukraine war that is based on not a U.S. perception of dominance, say NATO enlargement, but rather a peace that reflects a multipolar world. This is real. It's happening all over the world. And the fact of the matter is, the reason why this is a historic watershed is that the underlying economics and technological change have made it so the U.S. is no longer the dominant world economy, and the G7, which is the U.S., Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan, is actually smaller than the BRICS countries in economic size, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So we really are, in fact, in a multipolar world, but in ideology, we're in a conflict.
But Jeffrey Sachs, I wanted to ask about that. You mentioned the BRICS. The BRICS Bank that is now in China, and President Lula has named Dilma Rousseff as the head of the BRICS Bank. Its importance in terms of this multipolarity in the world economies, the potential for even the creation of alternative major currencies to the dollar as a result of the BRICS alliance. The impact of that on world affairs.
This is a big deal. And in fact, the United States is withdrawing. It doesn't know it necessarily. Our politicians don't understand this, but our politicians are withdrawing from the world financial and monetary scene and opening up the space for a completely different kind of international finance. I'll give you an example. The U.S. was the creator of the World Bank, but now the U.S. Congress won't put new money into the World Bank. And because of that, the World Bank's actually a quite small institution. It's got a big name, but it's a quite small institution in the financial scheme of things. The U.S. won't put more money in. The Congress says, no, why should we waste our money internationally and so forth? And you get a lot of hubbub about that. So China and the rest of the BRICS say, okay, we'll make our own development bank. And they established the new development bank, or sometimes called the BRICS Bank, based in Shanghai. And that's just one of the institutions that is really changing the scene. There's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, based in Beijing, in fact. There is, as President Lula said, and it's happening also in the context of the Ukraine war, a move away from the use of the dollar, which the United States has thought, well, that's our ace in the hole. You know, that is our ultimate hold on things, because we can use sanctions, we can use our financial control to keep other countries in line. But other countries are saying, not so much. We'll trade in renminbi, we'll trade in rubles, we'll trade in rupees, we'll trade in our own national currencies. And they're quickly setting up alternative institutions to do this. The United States doubles down. We will confiscate your reserves. We will, if you don't follow. And the other countries are saying, you know, if you want to go through the UN and get really multilateral rules, we're with you. But if you want to just impose the rules, we won't follow along. And so we have this very funny expression called a rule-based international order. The United States government uses it every day. But what does it mean? Who writes the rules? And what most of the world wants, in fact, is rules written in a multipolar or multilateral setting, not rules written by the United States and a few friends and allies.
I wanted to ask you, you've been an advisor to the United Nations for quite often. The issue of how much longer the permanent members of the Security Council can keep the number to 5, because clearly Brazil and other countries of the global south have been saying the UN needs to be reformed. And countries from Latin America, specifically Brazil and Africa, should have representation on the UN Security Council, permanent members.
Yes, you know, the P5, the permanent 5, which is the United States, China, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, was the World War II victor group in 1945. They wrote into the rules of the UN, incidentally, that they would be the permanent Security Council members and have a veto over any change in the UN Charter. So it's really a group that gave itself power that the other 188 countries of the world look on and say, what is this? We need change. I would say the country that is most amazed and frustrated by this, in fact, is India. India is now the most populous country in the world. The United States has 335 million, roughly, in the population. Britain, France, roughly 60 million. India, 1.4 billion, not on the Security Council, a nuclear power, a world superpower, the president of the G20 this year, really not happy about that. Brazil, the largest economy of South America, similarly not on the Security Council. So this has been an issue for more than 20 years. The P5 in various ways have blocked particular countries, but added up, the P5 have said, you know what, this is our club. We want to stay as the permanent 5. But I think as we really face the reality of it's not just a post-US dominated world, but actually a post-Western dominated world, because it was the US as the dominant power among the so-called West, which means the US, Britain, European Union, and honorary Western membership, Japan, let's say. But we're post-Western as well as post-US in dominance. And these international institutions will need to change or they won't function in the 21st century. And if they don't function, it's actually a disaster for us. If they didn't exist, we'd have to make them because we need them to function. So we also need to renovate them.
I wanted to talk about China negotiating these various agreements. Let's turn to Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, speaking before his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
What does Putin want? Putin can't keep Ukraine's territory. Maybe we don't even discuss Crimea, but he will have to rethink what he has invaded. Also, Zelensky can't have everything he wants to demand. NATO will not be able to set itself up at the border, so this is something we have to put on the table. I think this war has dragged on for too long. Brazil has already criticized what it had to criticize. Brazil defends each nation's territorial integrity, so we disagree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Because it looks like Ukraine is on the verge of a major counteroffensive against Russia. And in order to do this, needs massive support from Western countries, meaning military weapons. Can you talk about what China's role is here, the peace plan it has put forward, but also these other deals that China is helping to negotiate, like the successful rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then what they're suggesting about Israel and Palestine?
President Lula uttered in a few words the core of this issue that most of our media dare not explain to the American people, and that is the expansion of NATO. This is a war fundamentally about the U.S. attempt to expand a U.S. military alliance to Ukraine and to Georgia. Georgia is a country in the Caucasus, also on the Black Sea. The U.S. strategy, going back decades, has been to surround Russia in the Black Sea, with Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all NATO members surrounding Russia and its naval fleet in the Black Sea, with a naval fleet that has been the Black Sea naval fleet of Russia since 1783. Russia has said, this is our red line, and it has said that for decades. And it said this clearly in 2007, before George W. Bush Jr. had I'll call it the harebrained idea to announce in 2008 and force NATO to announce that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. And this is what President Lula was saying and what President Xi Jinping of China has been saying. We can't have a war that is essentially a proxy war between Russia and the United States over the expansion of the U.S. military alliance right up to a 1,200-kilometer and more border with Russia, which Russia views, and I would say understandably views, as a fundamental national security threat to Russia. Keep some space, keep some distance. That's President Lula's meaning. That's what China means when it says in its peace plan, we want a peace plan that respects the security interests of all parties. What that is code word for saying, make peace, end the war, but don't expand NATO right up to the border. The American people have not heard an explanation of this all along. It's shocking to me because as a close observer of this for 30 years, this has been the casus belli. And yet our newspapers won't even report the background to this. But this is why China, South Africa, India, Brazil are saying we want peace, but we don't want NATO expansion as the meaning of so-called peace. We want the big superpowers to give each other some space and some distance so that the world isn't on a knife edge. That's exactly what President Lula was saying, and it's exactly what the meaning of the Chinese peace initiative is to say, yes, absolutely make peace, protect Ukraine's sovereignty and its security, but no to NATO expansion. But the Biden administration won't even discuss this issue. That has been the major failing and the reason why we have not been able to get to the negotiating table, in my opinion. Even when Zelensky said in March 2022, maybe not NATO, maybe something else, Russia and Ukraine were close to an agreement, and the United States intervened with Ukraine and said, we don't think that's a good agreement, because the U.S. neocons, so-called, have been pushing for NATO enlargement as the core of this issue. But this goes back to the more general point for us, which is that what is at stake in Ukraine and over Taiwan and many other issues from the point of view of China or Russia or other countries, including Brazil, now Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, is whether the U.S. does what it wants to do or whether the U.S. respects some limits based on what other countries say, well, this is what we think, so that we need true multipolarity, not U.S. dominance alone. Rules written by all of us, not rules written just by the United States.
And Jeff Sachs, we only have a few, about a minute left, but I was wondering if you could comment on the parallels between this expansion of NATO further and further east in Europe. This year marks the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, of President Monroe declaring to all the European powers that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to them attempting to move their forces and their militaries into Latin America. And for these past 200 years, Latin America has essentially been the major sphere of influence of the United States. And yet here we are saying that Russia has no right to declare that its immediate the countries immediately its borders cannot welcome in NATO troops.
Well, yes, a little empathy would go a long way and would have spared us actually a lot of wars. But for Americans, it would be useful to think, suppose Mexico made a military alliance with China. Would the United States say, well, that's Mexico's right, what are we going to do about it? Or might there be actually an invasion in short order or something like that? I would strongly advise to China and Mexico, don't try it at home. Don't experiment with this. But the United States government refuses that empathy because, in other words, refuses to put itself in the position of the other side. That's the fundamental arrogance of thinking that you determine the rules of the world. The problem with arrogance is not only the comeuppance from it, but you stumble into terrible crises that you don't even understand because the United States has not been allowed, the public has not been allowed to even think from the perspective of the other side. So the analogy is actually a very, very clear analogy. It is what China and Russia and others say all the time is, why have those double standards? Why don't we actually deal with each other with mutual respect, not with the rules that you write?